In the quiet of the palace courtyard, the tall, stoic royal guards stood motionless, their faces unreadable beneath their perfectly polished helmets. Known for their unwavering discipline and unbreakable silence, these guards seemed almost like statues, each one trained to keep emotions at bay, no matter the circumstance. But what happens when life itself pulls at their carefully maintained resolve, stirring something deep within them, something that they can't keep hidden? Today, we bring you into a world rarely seen by the public, the moments when royal guards break character and, for just a heartbeat, reveal the humanity behind the uniform. These fleeting acts of respect, of kindness, of something too raw to ignore, bring a sense of warmth and closeness to an otherwise distant tradition. From encounters with young children who remind them of their own kids, back home to those vulnerable moments with elderly veterans who hold decades of stories in their eyes, these guards are occasionally faced with moments that make them pause. And though they're trained not to falter, there are times when the weight of tradition and duty gives way to something far more powerful: compassion. As we follow the journey of one particular guard, a man known for his unparalleled dedication to the crown, we'll witness his inner struggle as he encounters a young girl standing at the gates, clutching a small, tattered bear. She gazes up at him, her eyes wide with admiration and something he can't quite place: sorrow, perhaps. He's trained to look away, to focus on the distance, but something in her gaze keeps pulling him back. Despite every rule urging him to remain still, he finds himself subtly leaning forward, just enough to hear the soft words she murmurs about her father, a soldier lost in the line of duty. The words land like a whisper, and for a brief moment, he feels a shift, a tension that challenges his training, daring him to acknowledge her presence. Our story takes us through a series of these unguarded moments where the guards face people from every walk of life: grieving widows, young children with questions they're too young to understand, and veterans who nod in silent respect. Each encounter asks more of them than their usual stance, yet they answer with acts that speak louder than words ever could. It's these rare glimpses of vulnerability and kindness that remind us all of the hearts behind the ironclad tradition. But in this tale, not every story ends with a quiet smile or a warm gesture. Sometimes, the choice to show kindness comes at a price. Just as our guard begins to question what it means to serve, whether it's loyalty to the crown or compassion for the people he's sworn to protect, he finds himself at a crossroads where one simple act of kindness could change everything. Will he risk breaking the rules? Will he dare to step out of line for just 1 second, even if it means facing consequences? Or will he let duty win over humanity? Join us as we explore these unforgettable moments when royal guards, trained to be silent and unyielding, reveal the deep-seated compassion hidden within their hearts. The young guard's name was Thomas, and he had served in the Royal Guard for nearly 5 years. Like every other man in his regiment, he was trained to endure hours of stillness, days of silence, and weeks of routine. It was not a job for the faint of heart or the easily distracted. Most saw the uniform and felt pride, but for Thomas, there was a weight to it, an unspoken code that bound him to his duty. His father, a stern but loving man, had served as a soldier before him, instilling in Thomas from a young age the importance of duty and honor. But he hadn't expected that duty to be so cold, so unyielding. Life as a royal guard demanded more than most realized. Friends outside of work often joked about how easy his job must be, standing still for hours on end, occasionally patrolling the palace grounds. But Thomas knew better. The work required a depth of patience that was almost meditative, a resolve to stay detached from the world around him. He had perfected that detachment until recently. That moment with the little girl clutching her teddy bear had unlocked something he had long buried. He wasn't even sure what it was yet, only that it felt different, that it stirred a long-buried ache within him. That ache stayed with him as he went through his routine. A part of him tried to push it away, to ignore the quiet echo of her soft voice as she spoke of her father. But another part of him, the part that remembered what it felt like to be just a boy watching his father leave for service, couldn't shake it. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, seeing her tiny fingers wrapped around the bear, the way her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she spoke. He hadn't responded. He wasn't supposed to. But he wondered what it might have meant to her if he had said something, even just a simple word of comfort. Days passed, and the memories of that encounter continued to linger, growing stronger each time he took his position at the palace gates. Then, one cold, rainy afternoon, he noticed an elderly man hobbling up the cobbled path toward the entrance. The man wore a faded military jacket and walked with the help of a cane. His face was creased with age, yet his eyes held a sharpness that spoke of a lifetime of service and sacrifice. As he drew closer, Thomas could see the medals pinned to the man's chest, their colors muted but unmistakable. Other guards had noticed him, but they remained still, their gaze fixed forward. Thomas, however, couldn't help but feel a pull toward the man, a curiosity mixed with respect. The old man stopped before them, standing silently, his gaze unwavering as he looked up at the palace. Thomas could see the hint of something in his expression, pride, perhaps, or maybe it was sorrow. He watched as the man lifted a trembling hand to his forehead in a respectful salute. Despite his best efforts, Thomas felt the stirrings of emotion rise within him again. He wanted to acknowledge the man's silent tribute, to let him know that his sacrifice hadn't gone unnoticed. But he fought the urge, keeping his stance steady, reminding himself of his training. Still, he couldn't help but feel a pang of regret as he watched the elderly man turn and slowly walk away, his head bowed. Each encounter seemed to weigh on Thomas more than the last. He found himself wondering about the people who approached him, about the stories they carried. His mind wandered, picturing the lives that had intersected with his own, however briefly. But it wasn't until a few weeks later that something happened that would test the limits of his resolve entirely. It was a warm summer day, the kind that brought tourists and families to the palace in droves. Thomas and his fellow guards stood in their usual positions, unmoving and silent. Suddenly, a loud commotion broke out near the entrance. Thomas kept his gaze forward, but from the corner of his eye, he could see a man struggling to make his way through the crowd. People stepped aside as he passed, some watching with curiosity, others whispering to each other. The man seemed disheveled, his clothes wrinkled and worn, his face a mix of anger and despair. He stopped right in front of Thomas, his eyes red-rimmed and frantic. For a moment, Thomas felt a chill run down his spine, sensing that something was very wrong. The man's voice cracked as he began to speak, pleading for someone, anyone, to listen. He spoke of a loved one in need, of the hardship he was facing, of a life that was slipping through his fingers. His words tumbled out, desperate and raw, and for a brief moment, Thomas felt his own stoic resolve begin to waver. The man's pain was so palpable, so real, that it cut through every layer of detachment Thomas had carefully constructed. But he reminded himself of his duty, his responsibility to remain impartial. Yet, the man's desperation seemed to cling to the air, growing heavier with each passing second. Thomas could see the confusion in the crowd, the mixed reactions of sympathy and discomfort. And there, in the middle of it all, he stood like a silent pillar, unable to respond, unable to break the rules that bound him to his post. Finally, another guard stepped forward to gently guide the man away, offering a few quiet words that seemed to calm him, if only slightly. Thomas watched as the man was led away, feeling a strange mix of relief and guilt. He had followed the rules, done what was expected of him, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed somehow. As the day wore on, Thomas couldn't escape the weight of these encounters. He had been trained to serve without question, to maintain order and uphold tradition. But now he found himself questioning what it all truly meant. What was his purpose if he couldn't even show kindness when it was needed most? Each face he had encountered lingered in his mind, a collection of lives that had brushed against his own, leaving invisible marks that no amount of training could erase. In the stillness of the palace courtyard that evening, as he removed his helmet and took a deep breath of the cooling air, Thomas knew he was reaching a breaking point. He had always been proud of his service, honored to wear the uniform, But he couldn't ignore the pull of compassion any longer. He was beginning to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to his duty than standing guard. The question was, what would he do the next time he was faced with someone in need? Would he remain the unyielding figure he was trained to be, or would he risk everything to show the kindness that was building within him, threatening to break free? With that unresolved question hanging over him, Thomas prepared for another day, wondering what it would take for him to truly understand the balance between duty and humanity. The next morning, Thomas was back at his post. The air was crisp, and the sun had barely risen, casting a soft, pale light over the palace grounds. He tried to shake off the thoughts that had plagued him the night before, but they lingered, an uninvited weight in his chest. The encounters, the young girl, the elderly veteran, the desperate man, they felt like ghosts that clung to him, haunting his every step. He knew he couldn't speak to anyone about this, not his fellow guards, and certainly not his superiors. Showing weakness, even mentioning doubt, was against everything he'd been taught. As tourists began trickling in, Thomas settled back into his stance, his eyes fixed forward, his body still. Yet, for the first time, he noticed every detail around him with an almost painful clarity. He saw the faces of each visitor, their expressions full of wonder, respect, and curiosity as they took in the palace and its guarded secrets. He saw families, young and old, children skipping happily beside their parents, and elderly couples walking hand in hand. Each group reminded him of the faces he'd encountered before, faces carrying stories he'd only begun to understand. The feeling in his chest grew heavier. A group of schoolchildren approached, their chaperone reminding them in a hushed voice to be respectful. The children giggled and whispered among themselves, their eyes wide as they stared at the guards. One little boy, barely able to contain his excitement, pointed at Thomas, his face lighting up with pure admiration. Thomas felt a small tug at the corner of his mouth, a reflexive urge to smile, but he held it back, steadying his expression. Still, he couldn't shake the thought. Was this how people saw him? A figure to be admired, but never truly known. As the day wore on, another figure caught his eye, a young woman dressed in somber clothes, clutching a small bouquet of flowers. She walked with a sense of purpose, her face etched with sadness. She paused a few feet away from the line of guards, her gaze drifting upward toward the palace, before she carefully placed the flowers at the base of the wall. She lingered there for a moment, her lips moving in silent words, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. Thomas knew he wasn't supposed to watch, wasn't supposed to care, but something in her gesture, in her quiet grief, struck him deeply. As she straightened and turned to leave, her eyes met his for a split second. In that moment, Thomas felt an almost electric jolt, as if her sorrow had leaped from her heart to his own. He knew nothing of her story, didn't know who she was or whom she mourned, but he could feel the weight of her loss, an invisible thread binding them in shared, silent understanding. It was only a glance, barely a heartbeat in time, yet it left him shaken. Over the next few days, Thomas continued to encounter people who left him questioning everything. There was a young father who lifted his son onto his shoulders, pointing out the palace guards and speaking softly about bravery and honor. There was an elderly woman who paused to whisper a prayer near the gates, her face a mask of resilience and quiet hope. Each face held a different story, a different perspective, but all seemed to pull at something within him, challenging the very essence of his role. One rainy afternoon, as he stood at his post, Thomas noticed a figure lingering near the palace gates. It was the same young girl with the teddy bear, the one he had seen weeks ago. She was back, standing alone in the rain, her small figure shivering slightly under the cold drizzle. His heart clenched as he saw her, a pang of protectiveness that surprised him. He wanted to step forward, to ask her why she was here again, to offer her some kind of comfort. But his training screamed at him to stay still, to remain the silent, unyielding guard. She didn't move closer, simply stood there, looking up at the palace with wide, tear-filled eyes. After a few moments, she whispered something, too soft for him to hear, yet he felt its impact all the same. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she turned and walked away, leaving Thomas to wonder what had brought her back and what unspoken pain lingered in her heart. He knew he would likely never know, yet he felt an inexplicable urge to reach out, to offer her something, anything, that could ease her sorrow. Each encounter, each fleeting moment, left Thomas more uncertain than before. He began to question the rules he had once followed without a second thought. Was it truly better to remain detached, to never acknowledge the people who sought solace or comfort in his presence? Or was there value, even honor, in breaking the silence, in showing a human side beneath the uniform? As he wrestled with these questions, Thomas found himself becoming more distant from his fellow guards. They hadn't noticed, too caught up in their own routines to sense the conflict brewing within him. But one guard in particular, a seasoned veteran named Henry, had begun to watch him closely. Henry was a man of few words, a man who had served faithfully for over 2 decades. He had a way of observing without speaking, of understanding without prying. One evening, as they prepared to leave their posts, Henry approached Thomas. He didn't ask any questions, didn't make small talk, but simply looked at him with a quiet understanding. "It's not easy, is it?" Henry said, his voice low and calm. Thomas felt a jolt of surprise, but he didn't respond. He couldn't admit what he was feeling, not even to Henry. Yet something in the older guard's eyes told him he didn't have to. Henry had been there too, had seen the faces, felt the pull of compassion warring with duty. "Remember," Henry continued, "we serve for a reason. But it's not wrong to feel, Thomas. It's what makes us human." With that, he walked away, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts, with the knowledge that perhaps he wasn't as alone as he had thought. As the days passed, Thomas felt the tension within him growing, the conflict between duty and compassion reaching a breaking point. He knew he couldn't go on like this, couldn't keep ignoring the voices calling out to him, the faces that haunted his every thought. But what would it mean to break the silence, to let his guard down? Would it cost him his position, his honor, or would it grant him a peace he hadn't known was possible? With each encounter, the choice grew clearer, yet the consequences loomed larger. He stood at a crossroads, torn between the man he was trained to be and the man he felt he was becoming. The question remained, would he dare to choose compassion, or would duty win out once more? The pressure within Thomas reached a boiling point, an intensity he could no longer suppress. Day after day, he encountered faces filled with hope, sadness, curiosity, and even grief. Each one chipped away at the stoic facade he had carefully crafted, and he knew it was only a matter of time before something had to give. His heart was pulling him in one direction, but the weight of his duty felt like an anchor, holding him firmly to the ground. He could feel his resolve slipping, like a rope slowly unraveling strand by strand. One cold morning, as he took his position at the gates, he noticed an unusual amount of activity nearby. People were gathered in hushed clusters, their expressions somber. A whisper moved through the crowd, and Thomas caught fragments of conversation, a name, spoken with quiet reverence, and words of loss and remembrance. He realized it was a memorial service for a soldier who had recently passed, someone who had served bravely in the line of duty. The soldier's family was present, their grief palpable even from a distance. As the family approached the palace gates to pay their respects, Thomas's heart tightened. The soldier's mother, an elderly woman with silver-streaked hair, held a single white flower in her hand, her steps slow and heavy. Beside her was a young woman, perhaps the soldier's sister, clutching a folded photograph to her chest. They stopped just a few feet away from where Thomas stood, their eyes fixed on the towering gates, the silent guards, the grandeur of the palace, symbols of loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. The older woman looked up at Thomas, her gaze filled with a silent plea, a raw and unspoken question. He wanted so desperately to offer her something in return, a nod, a word, anything to let her know her son's sacrifice was honored, that he was not forgotten. But his training held him back, the weight of tradition pressing down on him. He stayed still, his face a mask of indifference, though inside his heart was breaking. He had never felt so trapped, so torn between the duty he had sworn to uphold and the compassion he could no longer ignore. The mother extended the flower toward him, her hand trembling. He felt the urge to reach out, to take it, to give her something, a gesture that would acknowledge her loss. But his hand remained at his side, frozen by the invisible chains of his role. She lingered for a moment, her face a mixture of disappointment and sadness, before she finally placed the flower at the base of the gate and walked away, her shoulders slumped. That night, Thomas could hardly sleep. He kept seeing the mother's face, the silent question in her eyes. He had been trained to serve without question, to be strong and unwavering. But he couldn't ignore the feeling that he had somehow failed her, failed himself. He was beginning to wonder if duty meant more than simply following orders, if perhaps there was room for humanity within the unyielding walls of tradition. A few days later, as he was stationed near the palace, a sudden commotion caught his attention. A young boy had wandered too close to the guards, slipping past the roped barriers in his excitement. His mother called out to him, her voice filled with panic as she struggled to reach him through the crowd. Thomas's instinct was to move, to help, but his training told him to stay still, to let security handle it. Yet, as he watched the boy's frightened face, his heart ached with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Before he even realized what he was doing, Thomas took a step forward, breaking formation. The crowd gasped, and a wave of whispers rippled through the onlookers. He knelt down beside the boy, meeting his wide-eyed gaze with a soft, reassuring look. "You're safe," he whispered, keeping his voice low and steady. "Your mom's right over there." He gently took the boy's hand, guiding him back to the waiting arms of his mother. The mother looked at Thomas with a mixture of relief and gratitude, her eyes shining with unspoken thanks. Thomas nodded, the smallest of gestures, but one that spoke volumes. He returned to his post, his face once again a mask of discipline, but inside, he felt a strange sense of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He had crossed a line, and he knew it. But for the first time, he felt he had done something right, something that mattered. Word spread quickly among the guards, whispers of what Thomas had done reaching every corner of the palace grounds. Some looked at him with disapproval, others with quiet respect. He could sense the shift, feel the scrutiny of his actions, yet he felt no regret. He was beginning to understand that duty wasn't just about following orders. It was about honoring the people they served, about recognizing the humanity that connected them all. But the real test came just days later. An unexpected visitor arrived, a soldier's widow, carrying a letter from her late husband. She had traveled a long distance to deliver it to the palace, hoping to leave it in memory of the man she had loved and lost. As she approached the gates, she looked at the guards, her face a mixture of sadness and determination. She wanted to leave the letter as a tribute, a final message of love and remembrance. The guards remained still, their eyes fixed forward, but Thomas could feel the weight of her grief, the quiet desperation in her stance. She held out the letter, her hand trembling, her gaze pleading for someone to acknowledge her loss. Thomas felt his heart pounding, every instinct telling him to step forward, to break the rules once again. He knew the consequences would be severe, but he risked everything he had worked for. The crowd watched in silence, their eyes shifting from the widow to the guards, sensing the tension, the unspoken conflict. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the pull of duty and compassion twisting within him. He knew he stood at a crossroad, a moment that would define who he was, not just as a guard, but as a man. He wanted to honor the memory of the fallen soldier, to give this grieving widow the closure she sought. But he also knew the weight of the expectations placed upon him, the duty he had sworn to uphold. As he looked into her tear-filled eyes, he felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly took his breath away. He was on the edge, caught between tradition and the call of his own heart. He knew that whichever choice he made, there would be no turning back. The moment stretched out, heavy with anticipation, as the crowd held its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. Thomas stood, caught in a moment that felt suspended in time, with the widow's letter reaching toward him like a fragile bridge between duty and empathy. The weight of every choice he'd made since becoming a guard seemed to press down on him, each one pulling him toward the carefully drawn lines of his role. The widow's hand remained extended, her eyes locked onto his with a silent plea that shook him to his core. He could sense the crowd holding its breath, watching, waiting, as if they too understood the gravity of his decision. This was no longer a simple encounter. It had become a defining moment, and Thomas felt himself teetering on the edge of breaking. As he wrestled with the choice, a senior officer appeared, moving briskly through the crowd. The officer's face was unreadable, but Thomas could feel the weight of his gaze. It was clear that word of Thomas's recent actions had traveled up the chain, and he could see in the officer's expression a mixture of curiosity and perhaps even disapproval. This was a man who embodied the rules, who viewed the tradition of guarding the palace as something almost sacred. Thomas knew that one wrong move now could cost him everything: his position, his honor, and perhaps even the small victories of kindness he had dared to make. The officer's arrival sent a ripple of tension through the crowd, and Thomas felt a surge of panic rise within him. The widow, too, seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, her hand faltering slightly, her eyes darting between Thomas and the officer. For a brief moment, she lowered the letter, clutching it tightly to her chest, as if shielding it from the scrutiny of the watchful eyes around her. The officer stepped forward, his voice calm but stern as he addressed Thomas. "Is there a problem here, guardsman?" he asked, his gaze flickering momentarily toward the widow, who stood frozen in uncertainty. Thomas could feel the tension in the air thickening, each second stretching out painfully. His heart raced, pounding in his chest as he struggled to find his voice. "No, sir," he replied, his tone measured, though he felt anything but calm. "The widow wishes to leave a letter in memory of her husband, who served with honor." He didn't dare look directly at the officer, fearing that any hint of emotion in his eyes might betray the turmoil raging within him. The officer regarded Thomas for a moment, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention to the widow. She stood her ground, clutching the letter tightly, her gaze steady but filled with unspoken pain. The officer's face softened ever so slightly, though his tone remained formal. "I'm afraid we cannot permit personal tributes at the palace gates," he said, his voice carrying a weight of finality that seemed to close off any hope. "There are rules in place to maintain order and respect for all who serve here." Thomas felt a pang of frustration, a sense of helplessness that he struggled to keep hidden. He knew the rules well, had lived by them for years, but in that moment, they felt suffocating, a wall separating him from the humanity he so desperately wanted to honor. He glanced at the widow, her face crumbling as the officer's words sank in. She looked down at the letter, her fingers trembling as she held it close to her heart, and Thomas felt a surge of anger and sadness on her behalf. Was this what his duty had become, turning away those in pain, denying them the simple act of remembrance? In an unexpected twist, the officer turned to Thomas once more, his expression softening just a fraction. "We serve to protect and uphold honor, guardsman," he said quietly, his gaze intense. "But sometimes, respect is shown in ways that aren't always written in rules." It was a subtle hint, one that left Thomas feeling both hopeful and confused. The officer then turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Thomas and the widow standing alone, with the crowd watching in breathless anticipation. Thomas looked back at the widow, who met his gaze with a hesitant but hopeful expression. He felt a renewed sense of determination, the officer's words echoing in his mind. Perhaps there was a way to honor both his duty and his heart, to find a balance between tradition and compassion. Taking a deep breath, he took a small, almost imperceptible step forward, extending his hand toward the widow. She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief, before she placed the letter gently in his open palm. The crowd murmured in surprise, and Thomas felt a surge of emotion as he held the letter, the fragile weight of the widow's trust resting in his hand. He turned toward the gates, his steps steady and purposeful, feeling the gaze of the onlookers, the silent support of the widow, and the watchful eye of his fellow guards. With a reverent gesture, he placed the letter at the base of the gate, a simple act of respect that spoke volumes. But just as he began to turn back, a loud voice rang out from the crowd, calling his name. He froze, recognizing the voice immediately. It was his father. Thomas turned slowly, his heart pounding as he spotted his father pushing through the crowd, his face a mixture of pride and concern. His father had always been a firm believer in discipline and tradition, values he had instilled in Thomas from a young age. Seeing his father here, at this moment, felt like the final twist, the ultimate test of his convictions. Thomas's father approached, his gaze filled with a complicated mix of emotions. "Son," he began, his voice low and steady, "I saw what you did." There was no anger in his tone, no hint of disappointment. Instead, there was a quiet respect, an understanding that seemed to bridge the gap between them. "I always taught you to honor your duty," his father continued, his eyes never leaving Thomas. "But today, you honored something deeper. I'm proud of you, son." The officer looked around the humble room, taking in the scene, the young man kneeling by his father, Thomas standing at his side, unwavering in his decision to help. For a moment, silence filled the room, tension thickening the air. Then, to Thomas's surprise, the officer's face softened, and he gave a brief nod of approval. "Sometimes duty requires us to go beyond the palace walls," he said quietly, his gaze meeting Thomas's with a look of understanding. "You've shown honor today, Thomas, the kind that truly matters." The unexpected support from his superior filled Thomas with a profound sense of relief. He had feared reprimand, perhaps even dismissal, but instead, he felt a sense of validation, as though the values he held close had been affirmed by those around him. The other guards nodded respectfully, silently acknowledging Thomas's actions. He realized that by stepping beyond tradition, he had not only honored his duty, but inspired those around him to see their role in a new light. As the old man drifted back into a peaceful sleep, Thomas quietly slipped out of the house, the young man following him to the door, his face filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You've given my father peace, knowing that he wasn't forgotten." Thomas nodded, his own heart full as he took one last look at the small, humble home that had become the stage for a moment of true compassion. As he returned to his post, Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that his journey had just begun, that there would be more challenges, more moments where he would be called to make difficult choices. But he felt ready, more than ever, to face them with both honor and heart. In the end, he had found a way to bridge tradition and humanity, and in doing so, he had discovered the true essence of his duty. As Thomas resumed his post at the palace, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm, amber glow over the gates. He stood tall, feeling the weight of his uniform, but, for the first time, not as a burden. Instead, it felt like an honor, a reminder of the duty he'd chosen to uphold not only through discipline, but through compassion. His heart was lighter, his mind clearer, as he reflected on everything that had transpired: the widow, the mother, the young man and his father, and the surprising support from his fellow guards and the senior officer. The palace grounds, once a place of strict routine, had become a place where real lives had intersected with duty, where sorrow had been met with respect and kindness had found a way through the cracks in tradition. Thomas realized that, though he had been afraid to break character, his actions had created a ripple. Those brief moments of connection had left a lasting impression, not only on the people he'd helped, but on everyone who had witnessed his choices. News of Thomas' actions had spread among the guards, some watching with quiet admiration, nodding respectfully as they passed, while others looked on thoughtfully, as though considering what it might mean for them. The invisible line that had separated them from the people they protected felt less rigid now, more human. Thomas had shown them that their roles didn't just have to be about stoic tradition, but could also carry the values of respect and empathy. Days passed, and Thomas found himself in quiet reflection, noticing how the small gestures had begun to change him, and perhaps those around him. He noticed more people approaching the gates with softer expressions, less afraid to meet the eyes of the guards. Some even nodded in silent acknowledgement, as if to say they understood the silent commitment that lay beneath the uniform. The palace gates had once been a place of formality, a symbol of separation, but now they felt like a space where respect flowed both ways. One afternoon, as Thomas stood at his post, he saw the young man again, walking toward him with a small, carefully wrapped package in his hands. There was no urgency in his step this time, only a calm gratitude that Thomas could see even before he reached the gate. The young man stopped before Thomas, bowing his head slightly before extending the package. "This is for you," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "My father wanted you to have this as a token of his thanks." Thomas took the package, surprised and touched by the gesture. He opened it carefully, revealing an old, well-worn medal. It was a service medal, one given to soldiers who had shown extraordinary bravery. The young man's father had worn it during his own years of service, and now it was being passed on to Thomas, a symbol of honor and courage that transcended generations. Thomas looked at the young man, his heart full, and nodded in silent appreciation. As the young man walked away, Thomas clutched the medal, feeling the weight of its history and the shared sacrifices it represented. It wasn't the type of recognition he had expected, but it was perhaps the most meaningful honor he'd ever received. In that moment, he understood that real respect wasn't measured in titles or ranks, but in the quiet, often unseen acts of kindness and understanding. In the following weeks, Thomas continued to serve, his actions subtly influencing those around him. He noticed fellow guards taking small steps of compassion, gestures that might have once seemed out of place, but now felt entirely natural. There was a sense of unity, a shared understanding that sometimes duty meant breaking character to show respect, to let kindness be seen. One evening, as he prepared to leave the palace grounds, Thomas was approached by the senior officer. The man's face, as always, held a hint of sternness, but his eyes were softer. He held out his hand, and Thomas noticed a slight smile, an expression he hadn't seen before. "You've set a new standard, Thomas," the officer said quietly. "A reminder that our duty goes beyond standing guard. I thank you for that." Thomas shook the officer's hand, feeling a deep sense of closure. He'd risked so much, faced uncertainty, and yet he had found a way to merge honor with humanity. He had gained the respect of those around him, but more importantly, he had shown them that sometimes respect was best shown through empathy and courage. As Thomas walked home that night, he thought about how much he had changed, how much those small moments had transformed him. He'd started his journey as a guard with a rigid sense of duty, but he was leaving with a profound understanding of what it meant to truly serve, and he knew without a doubt that he would continue to carry these values with him, even beyond the palace gates. The palace would remain a symbol of tradition, of honor and duty, but now it would also be a place where humanity could find a voice, even within the walls of the most guarded institution. And for Thomas, that was the greatest legacy he could hope to leave behind.